The wind at 5,300 meters does not sound like wind. It sounds like something tearing. It sounds like fabric being pulled apart by hands that are not hands, that have no body attached to them, that are made of pressure differentials and temperature gradients and the rotation of the earth. And the fabric is the air itself, and the tearing is constant. And Lidia Huayllas has been standing in it for 20 minutes. She is not moving. She is not cold. She is not afraid. She is 52 years old, and she is wearing a pollera, which is a skirt made of multiple layers of heavy fabric gathered at the waist and falling to the ankle. And when dry, it weighs approximately 3 kilograms, and when wet, it weighs more. And when frozen, it becomes something else entirely, a carapace, a shell, a cabinet of ice, and she is not cold. Her body is a machine that the Andes have been building for 10,000 years. She was born at 4,000 meters above sea level in a city called El Alto, which sprawls across the Altiplano above La Paz like a concrete lung. And she has spent 52 years breathing air that contains 40% less oxygen than the air at sea level. Her lungs are not like your lungs. Her blood is not like your blood. Her heart pumps a volume of oxygen that would kill a person from the lowlands, and it pumps it without effort, without strain, without the headache and the nausea and the pulmonary edema that kill tourists in the hotels of La Paz every year. The tourists who fly in from sea level and climb one flight of stairs and collapse. The tourists whose bodies are not built for thin air, whose blood thickens and whose lungs flood and whose brains swell. And Lidia does not think about any of this because she has never known anything else. She is Aymara. She is indigenous. She is standing at 5,300 meters in a skirt that her grandmother wore and that she wears now, and she is watching the ice disappear. The ice has been disappearing for her entire life. She did not always know this. She did not always understand that the white on the peaks was thinner than it had been when her grandmother was young, that the glaciers were retreating at a meter per year, then 2 meters, then 10, that the snow line was climbing higher every decade, that the ice that had been here for 18,000 years was now scheduled to vanish within her lifetime. She understood this for the first time in 2009, when she was 37 years old, standing on bare rock at 5,200 meters in a place called Chacaltaya. Chacaltaya was a glacier. It had been a glacier for 18,000 years. It was the highest ski resort in the world, a single lift and a lodge built in 1940, where the middle class of La Paz would come on weekends and ski on ice that had been laid down during the last ice age. Lidia had been to Chacaltaya as a girl. She had stood on the glacier and felt the strange cold that radiates from ancient ice, a cold that is not just temperature, but time, a cold that carries 18,000 winters in its crystals. She had watched her father point at the glacier and say something in Aymara that she did not understand and that she remembered. In 2009, she returned to Chacaltaya. The glacier was gone. The ice was gone. The ski lift stood over bare brown rock, a machine built to carry people up a slope that no longer existed, and Lidia stood on the rock and looked at the place where the ice had been, and she tried to remember what it had felt like to be cold in the way that ancient ice makes you cold, and she could not remember, and this was the first thing that frightened her, not the disappearance itself, the forgetting. She had already begun to forget what the ice felt like. Her children had never felt it. Her grandchildren would never feel it. The ice was becoming a story, and then it would become a legend, and then it would become nothing. And the nothing was what frightened her, because the Aymara people have already lost enough things to forgetting, and the ice was not going to be one more. Here is what the documentaries usually get wrong. They frame the Cholitas Escaladoras as a story about empowerment. Indigenous women marginalized for centuries, reclaiming their dignity on the highest peaks in the hemisphere. And that is true. It is not false. It is not a lie. But it is also not the whole thing. And the thing it leaves out is that Lidia did not start climbing because she wanted to prove something. She started climbing because she was afraid. She was afraid that her grandchildren would grow up in a world without glaciers, and she wanted to be able to tell them what a glacier looked like from above. She wanted to stand on the ice and look down at the world and memorize the color, which is not white, not exactly, but a pale electric blue that occurs only in ice that has been compressed for thousands of years until all the air bubbles have been squeezed out and the crystals have aligned into something that absorbs every wavelength of light except blue. And the blue is the color of the sky at the edge of space, and it is the color of the past, and it is disappearing. That was the reason. Not empowerment, not defiance, fear. The pure, cold, clarifying fear of someone who has watched a glacier die and understood that the glacier will not be the last thing to go. The pollera was imposed by the Spanish in the 16th century. This is important. The skirt that Lidia wears, the heavy gathered fabric, the multiple layers, the specific cut and weight and fall, was not chosen by Aymara women. It was required by colonial law. The Spanish conquerors, having destroyed the Inca Empire and subjugated the indigenous peoples of the Andes, needed a way to identify who was who. They needed a visual code, a system of clothing that would mark the indigenous population as separate and inferior, that would allow a Spanish official to glance at a crowd and know immediately who could be taxed, who could be conscripted, who could be ignored. The pollera was that code. It was a uniform of subjugation. The Aymara women were required to wear it, and they did. And for 300 years, the pollera marked them as the conquered, the colonized, the people whose land had been taken, and whose gods had been banned, and whose language had been suppressed, and whose children were taught in Spanish in schools that taught them to be ashamed of their mothers' skirts. And then something happened. It happened slowly, over generations. The way everything important happens slowly. The Aymara women began to decorate the pollera. They added embroidery. They added color. They added patterns that meant something in Aymara, patterns that the Spanish did not recognize because the Spanish were not looking at the women, because colonizers never look at the women. They turned the uniform of subjugation into a flag. They surrounded the Spanish imposition with their own visual language, and by surrounding it, they absorbed it, and by absorbing it, they reclaimed it, and by reclaiming it, they transformed it, and the pollera became something that the Spanish had not intended it to become. It became a symbol of Aymara identity. It became a garment of power. And when Lidia ties her pollera at the waist and feels the 3 kilograms of fabric settle around her hips and begins to climb, she is carrying 300 years of this history. And the history is heavy. And the history is also what holds her upright in wind that would knock a person without history to the ground. The bowler hat was added in the 1920s. A shipment of bowler hats arrived in La Paz, intended for British railway workers who were building the rail lines through the Andes. And the hats were the wrong size, too small for the European men who were supposed to wear them. And some merchant, whose name is lost to history, sold the hats to indigenous women instead. The women put them on. The hats sat on top of their heads at an angle that was not quite perpendicular and not quite parallel, an angle that was purely Aymara. And the women looked at themselves and decided that the hats were theirs now, and the bowler hat became part of the uniform, and the uniform became a statement, and the statement was, "We take what you discard and we make it sacred. We take what you impose and we make it powerful. We take what you do not want and we make it ours." Lidia wears the bowler hat when she climbs. It is never blown off. The wind at 5,300 meters cannot remove a hat that has been anchored by a century of defiance. In December of 2015, 11 women gathered at the base of Huayna Potosi. The mountain is 6,088 meters high. It sits in the Cordillera Real, the Royal Range, a spine of rock and ice that runs through western Bolivia like a frozen wave, and it is visible from La Paz on clear days, a white pyramid that dominates the eastern skyline, and the Aymara have a name for it that predates the Spanish, predates the Inca, predates everyone who ever wrote anything down about the Andes. 11 women. None of them had ever worn crampons. None of them had ever held an ice axe. None of them had ever climbed a mountain. They were cooks. They were porters. They worked at base camps for foreign mountaineering expeditions, and they had spent years watching climbers from Europe and North America and Japan arrive at altitude, struggle with the thin air, and summit mountains that the cooks had been looking at their entire lives without ever imagining that they could climb them. And one day, Lidia looked at the mountain and thought, why not us? Not as a question, as a statement. Why not us? The guide they hired was named Gonzalo. He had summited Everest twice. He was one of the most experienced high-altitude guides in Bolivia, and when the 11 women arrived in their polleras and their bowler hats, he initially refused to take them. He did not believe women in skirts could climb at altitude. He did not say this in so many words. He said things about equipment, about conditions, about the wind. The women looked at him. They did not argue. They waited. And eventually, for reasons that Gonzalo later could not fully explain, he agreed to take them up. He expected to turn back within 3 hours. He expected crampons slipping off leather shoes. He expected altitude sickness and panic and tears. What he got was 11 women who moved up the glacier with a rhythm that he had seen only in Sherpas and in the very best climbers from the high Himalaya. They did not complain. They did not stop. They did not ask how much further. They climbed with the same efficiency that their ancestors had used to build terraces at altitude, to carry loads across the altiplano, to survive in air that was never meant to support human life. And 7 hours after they left base camp, all 11 women stood on the summit of Huayna Potosí. Gonzalo said something in Spanish that Lidia did not hear because the wind was too loud. She could see his face. His face said everything. He later told an interviewer that he had never guided a group that moved with more discipline. He did not say anything about the skirts. He did not need to. The summit of Huayna Potosí is a small platform of rock and ice at the top of a ridge that falls away on both sides into the clouds. And when you stand there, you can see the full arc of the Cordillera Real stretching north and south, a chain of white peaks against a sky that is a deeper blue than any sky at lower altitude because there is less atmosphere between you and space. And Lidia stood on the summit and looked down at the world and felt something that she had never felt before. It was not triumph. It was not pride. It was recognition. The mountain recognized her. The mountain had been standing there for millions of years, and it had been climbed by hundreds of people, and not one of them had been an Aymara woman in a pollera, and now one was standing on its summit, and the mountain did not care, and the mountain also cared, and both things were true, and Lidia understood that this was the beginning of something. She did not yet know what. In May of 2016, the Cholitas summited Illimani. Illimani is 6,438 meters high. It dominates the skyline of La Paz, a massive white massif that catches the first light of dawn and holds it for an hour after the rest of the city is still in shadow. And the Aymara call it the guardian, the protector, the one who watches over the valley, and its glaciers supply drinking water to 2 million people in La Paz and El Alto. Since 1980, those glaciers have lost 40% of their mass. The mountain is dying slowly, in a way that the people below can see if they know what to look for, and most of them do not know or do not want to know, and Lidia knows. She climbed Illimani and stood on its summit and looked at the glaciers that she had been watching her entire life, and she could see the damage. She could see the thinning, the retreat, the blue veins of meltwater cutting channels through ice that was supposed to be permanent. She came down from Illimani and told the other women that they needed to climb more mountains, not for the summits, for the ice, for the record, for the grandchildren. They climbed Acotango. They climbed Parinacota. They climbed Pomerape. 5 of the highest volcanoes in Bolivia, strung along the border with Chile like beads on a frozen string, and the Cholitas summited all of them. Their bodies adapted, their techniques improved. The pollera, which the mountaineering establishment had dismissed as a handicap, turned out to be a technology. The layers trapped warm air against the body. The weight stabilized the climber in high winds. The gathered fabric allowed a range of motion that tight technical pants restricted. The Aymara women had been climbing in these skirts for centuries, up and down the steep streets of La Paz and El Alto, up and down the terraced hillsides, up and down the stairs that the Inca had cut into the mountains, and their bodies had adapted to the skirt, and the skirt had adapted to their bodies. And what looked like a disadvantage to Western eyes was in fact a perfect marriage of garment and terrain. The mountaineers who had laughed at the women in skirts stopped laughing. The women kept climbing. In January of 2019, the Cholitas Escaladoras traveled to Argentina. They carried their crampons and their ice axes and their polleras. They carried food and fuel and tents. They carried the huifala, the square flag of the indigenous peoples of the Andes, 7 colors in a checkerboard pattern representing the 7 regions of the Inca Empire, a flag that had been banned under colonial rule and suppressed under the Republic, and that now flew from government buildings in Bolivia because the indigenous majority had finally taken political power in a country that had been ruled by a European-descended minority for 500 years. They carried all of this to the base of Aconcagua, which is 6,961 meters high, which is the tallest mountain in the Western Hemisphere, which is the highest point on Earth outside the Himalayas, which kills climbers every year with winds that regularly exceed 100 kilometers per hour and temperatures that drop to minus 30 degrees Celsius and an altitude that pushes the human body past every limit it was designed to respect. The expedition took 14 days. They moved from base camp to Camp 1 to Camp 2 to Camp 3, carrying loads and acclimatizing and waiting for a weather window. And the waiting was the hardest part, because the wind at Camp 3 never stops. And the cold is a cold that gets into your bones and stays there. And the altitude makes every movement feel like swimming through honey. And the women did not complain. They melted snow for water. They told stories in Aymara. They adjusted each other's crampons and checked each other's harnesses and slept in a 4-person tent with their polleras wrapped around them like blankets. And on the morning of the summit push, Lidia woke at 2 in the morning and looked at the stars, which at 5,800 meters are so bright and so numerous that they cast shadows on the snow. And she thought about her grandmother. Her grandmother died in 2003. She had been born in a village in the Bolivian highlands at a time when indigenous people were not allowed to walk on the sidewalks of La Paz, when they were required to step into the street when a white person approached, when the pollera was a mark of shame that could get you denied service in a restaurant, denied entry to a government building, denied the basic dignities that people who are not indigenous take for granted because they have never had to fight for them. Her grandmother had worn the pollera through all of this. She had worn it through the Revolution of 1952, when the indigenous majority won the right to vote. She had worn it through the decades of military dictatorship and economic collapse and state violence. She had worn it in the streets and in the market and in the fields and in the home, and she had never taken it off. And when she died, Lidia took the pollera and the bowler hat and put them in a box, and she did not open the box for a year, because opening the box would mean accepting that her grandmother was gone, and she was not ready to accept that. And then she opened the box, and she put on the pollera, and she put on the bowler hat, and she decided that she was going to climb a mountain in her grandmother's skirt, and the skirt was going to fly at the summit, and the mountain was going to know that a woman had stood on top of it wearing the same garment that the Spanish had tried to use to break her people, and that her people had transformed into a weapon of survival. The summit push on Aconcagua began at 3 in the morning. The temperature was minus 25 degrees. The wind was 30 kilometers per hour and building. The women roped up and began to move, one crampon in front of the other, up the Canaleta, a steep gully of loose rock and ice that is the final obstacle before the summit, 1,000 vertical feet of suffering that every Aconcagua climber remembers for the rest of their life. Lidia moved through the canaleta with a rhythm that came from somewhere deeper than training, deeper than technique, deeper than anything she had learned in the 4 years since Huayna Potosí. It came from her blood. It came from the generations of Aymara women who had climbed before her, not mountains but stairs, fields, markets, lives. The steep, relentless vertical of indigenous survival in a country that had been designed to grind them down. The rhythm was their rhythm. The strength was their strength. The summit was their summit. And when Lidia reached the top of the canaleta and stepped onto the summit ridge and saw the cross that marks the highest point in the Americas, she did something that she had not done on any of the previous summits. She cried. She unfurled the wifala. The wind caught it and snapped it horizontal, the 7 colors bright against the blue-black sky, and the other women gathered around her, and someone took a photograph. And the photograph went around the world, and the world saw 11 indigenous women in polleras and bowler hats standing on top of the tallest mountain outside the Himalayas, and the world called it empowerment. And Lidia let them call it that, because empowerment was true, and it was also not the whole thing. The whole thing was the ice. The whole thing was the grandchildren. The whole thing was the grandmother who had stepped into the street when white people passed and who had never stopped wearing the skirt that marked her as lesser, and whose skirt was now flying at 6,961 meters above sea level, above every colonial law, above every indignity, above every person who had ever told an Aymara woman that she did not belong. Lidia's daughter is 28 years old. She works as a teacher in La Paz. She has climbed with the Cholitas twice, on smaller peaks, and she is proud of her mother, and she worries about her mother, and she has not yet decided whether she will become a climber herself. She grew up in a Bolivia that her grandmother would not recognize. The president is indigenous. The wifala flies over the presidential palace. The pollera is no longer a mark of shame, but the ice is still disappearing, and the water is still running out, and the grandchildren will still grow up in a world without glaciers, and Lidia's daughter knows this, and she teaches her students about climate change in Spanish and Aymara, and she tells them about the Cholitas Escaladoras, and she tells them that the mountains are dying, and she tells them that someone has to remember what the ice looked like, and that someone is them. Here is something that happened on Aconcagua that the photograph does not show. At Camp 2, at 5,500 meters, Lidia woke in the middle of the night and could not breathe. This is not unusual at altitude. What was unusual was that she was not afraid. She lay in her sleeping bag in the 4-person tent, with the wind rattling the nylon and the temperature at 20 below zero, and her lungs struggling to extract oxygen from air that had almost none. And she was not afraid, and she realized, lying there in the dark, that somewhere in the middle of all this climbing, she had stopped being afraid of the ice melting. She was still afraid for the ice, but she was no longer afraid for herself, because something had shifted in her body, something that was not just strength, not just adaptation, but a kind of belonging. She belonged to the mountain. The mountain belonged to her. The ice was dying, and she was alive, and both things were true. And the truth of the ice did not cancel the truth of her aliveness, and her aliveness did not cancel the truth of the ice. And lying in the dark at 5,500 meters with the wind tearing at the tent and her lungs working in their ancient Aymara rhythm, she made peace with the contradiction. This is what the documentaries cannot capture. They want triumph or tragedy. They want the summit or the fall. They do not want the middle of the night at Camp 2. The quiet acceptance that the thing you love is dying and that you cannot save it, and that you will love it anyway, that you will climb it anyway, that you will wear your grandmother's skirt to the top of it anyway, not to save it, but to witness it, to memorize it, to be able to tell the grandchildren what it looked like from above. The Tuni Glacier, which supplies water to La Paz and El Alto, is also disappearing. Scientists predicted it would last through 2025. They were wrong. It is going faster. The Andes have lost more than 40% of their glacial cover since the 1980s, and the rate is accelerating, and the cities below are running out of water, and the farmers in the Altiplano are watching their crops fail, and the people who have lived in these mountains for 10,000 years are facing a future in which the mountains can no longer sustain them. This is not a metaphor. This is not a documentary theme. This is 2 million people whose drinking water comes from ice that will not exist in 30 years. The Cholitas Escaladoras know this. They climb the mountains that are dying. They stand on the ice and measure its retreat with their own eyes. They come down and tell the story. And the story, if you listen to it carefully, is not about climbing. The climbing is the vehicle. The story is about what it means to love something that is disappearing, to belong to a place that is changing faster than any place has ever changed, to wear the clothing of your ancestors on a mountain that your grandchildren will know only from photographs. The Khumbu Glacier on Everest is retreating at 10 meters per year. The Hillary Step, the famous rock wall just below the summit, collapsed in 2015. The climbing window in the Andes is shrinking by roughly 2 weeks per decade. The ice is going. The ice is going faster than anyone predicted. And Lidia Huayllas is training for Everest. She runs the steep streets of El Alto. She climbs the stairs that her grandmother climbed. She carries loads at altitude and sleeps in a hypoxic tent and does the 1,000 small things that a person must do to prepare their body for the highest point on Earth. She wants to be the first indigenous woman in a pollera to stand on the summit of Everest. She does not know if she will make it. The funding is uncertain. The logistics are complex. The mountain is deadly. But she trains anyway, because training is what you do when the outcome is uncertain, because the training itself is a kind of prayer, a kind of offering, a way of telling the mountain that you are coming, that you are ready, that the skirt is still there, that the women are still climbing. But Everest is not the point. This is the other thing the documentaries get wrong. They frame the Cholitas as a story about summits, about records, about the highest and the hardest and the first. And the records are real, and the summits are real, and the Cholitas are proud of them. But the point is not the summit. The point is not the record. The point is not Everest. The point is what happens at 4 a.m. in a tent at 5,500 meters, when the wind is tearing at the nylon and you cannot breathe and you are not afraid. The point is the photograph that Lidia keeps in a plastic bag inside her sleeping bag, a photograph of her grandmother wearing the same pollera that Lidia wears now, standing in front of a house in a village whose name Lidia can no longer remember, with an expression on her face that says, "I survived. I survived the Spanish. I survived the colony. I survived the Republic. I survived the discrimination and the poverty and the indignity and the erasure. I survived all of it. And now my granddaughter is climbing mountains in my skirt. The point is that the skirt survived. The point is that the women survived. The point is that the Aymara people have been surviving in these mountains for longer than anyone can remember, and they will keep surviving. And the ice may be dying, but the people are not. And the people will remember the ice, and the people will tell the children about the ice, and the children will tell their children, and the ice will become a story, and the story will survive, and the story is what everything else is for. The wind at 5,300 meters is still tearing at the air. Lidia is still standing in it. The Cordillera Real stretches away to the north and south, a chain of white peaks against a sky that is the color of ancient ice. And somewhere below her, in the valleys, 2 million people are waking up and turning on their taps and drinking water that came from glaciers that are disappearing. And somewhere above her, the summit of Huayna Potosí is waiting. The same summit where she stood in December of 2015 with 10 other women in polleras and bowler hats, none of whom had ever held an ice axe, all of whom summited in 7 hours. And the mountain has not forgotten them, and the mountain will not forget them. And Lidia adjusts the brim of her bowler hat and tightens the waist of her pollera and begins to climb, and the skirt moves with her, and the wind moves with her. And the ice beneath her crampons is a meter thinner than it was when she first stood here. And she keeps climbing, because climbing is what she does. Because the ice is still here. Because she is still here, because her grandmother's skirt is still here. And the skirt has survived 300 years of people trying to erase it. And it will survive this too. And the women will keep climbing, and the mountains will keep calling. And the ice, for now, is still blue.